Well, thank you very much, Maged. It's a real joy to be back at this podium, or any podium at UBC. Actually, I've done this 3 times in the last month, so I am frequently invited back to many departments, except the planning school once in the fall, but whatever. Take that for what it means. We were given fairly strict guidelines for this panel. We were to talk about things that Vancouver succeeded at, mention a couple of failures, and then talk a little bit about the future. So I just want to very quickly, and really quickly, because we've heard it all about it this morning. I think the greatest single success in Vancouver in terms of shaping the city and the region has been the public sector intervention in private capital in the public interest. And as we heard from the earlier panel, by the way, there's only one thing harder than following the earlier panel, and that's following lunch. But the point of the matter is that was a fantastic review of precisely the point that I'm trying to make, that we came out of an era in Canada in the post-war period in which the public good was the focus of all public policy. It's a term we rarely hear at any level of political discourse today, but much of what we heard this morning was precisely the result of some recognition that there was a public good, that governments had a right to intervene in the allocation of capital in marketplaces to create a better environment for all of us. And I think the emergence of Vancouver as the most livable city, or one of the most on the planet, has a great deal to owe to that. Well, of course, coming out of that has been our pioneering of mixed-use development, the podium kind of style of architecture that is so characterized in the concept of Vancouverism, a perfect example of that kind of negotiation between public and private capital in this case. And the third, I think, is a real credit to, is Mike still here? The defeat of the automobile. And it's one of the few cities, major cities, where the car has not really dominated the shape of the city to the extent that it might otherwise done. We haven't obviously cleared ourselves of that yet. We were one of the highest ownerships of SUV per capita on the continent. Nevertheless, I think that was a major achievement. And in many respects, that has made Vancouver what I would think of as the champion of livability. We are the livable city. It came out of the livable region. And of course, that's much of what Vancouverism is really all about. But the rest of what I'm going to say is an argument that livability is not the same as sustainability. The current, if you will, lifestyle and configuration of Vancouver in the world that is emerging is not sustainable. It might have been sustainable had the world frozen in the 1960s or 70s. But we've merged into a completely different world now. We began to hint at it in some of our discussion this morning, but we didn't get very far into that. So I'm going to argue that Vancouver's sustainability challenge has only just begun. And what we need to do, and the great failure of planning to date, has been the active attempt to think systemically about the role of urban regions in a global context. It used to be that globalization simply meant connections among different regions. But the fact of the matter is now that those connections and the sheer scale of the human enterprise have begun to change the global system in ways that feed back on every single locale in that system, including Vancouver. And the major, I suppose, proximal factor behind this is that this is a world in overshoot. The human enterprise is now using ecosystems and natural systems at about 50% faster, at a greater rate by 50% than they can regenerate. It takes a year and a half now for planetary systems to produce what we consume in a year on Earth. How do we manage to continue to go forward in these circumstances? Because we're drawing down enormous stocks of accumulated natural capital, from soils to fish stocks to oil and gas, and so on and so forth. So it's possible to remain on that trajectory of overshoot for some decades before it starts to bite hard. Here's how it looks from the city point of view in the context of eco-footprint analysis. We take for granted our connections to the rest of the planet. The reality is, though, that if we look at those in some detail, if we trace the flows of goods and services and the energy and materials required to maintain the lifestyle of a major city like Vancouver, we find that the physical area of the city is a tiny fraction of 1% of the total area of the planet dedicated exclusively to sustaining the lifestyles of people living in this city. In the case of Vancouver City proper, the area of the Earth dedicated to sustaining this city is about 300 times larger than the city footprint. Even if we go to the regional area, where there's a great deal of cropland and forest and so on, it's a factor of around 50. 50 times as much land scattered all over the planet, land and water ecosystems, are dedicated to producing the goods and services that we consume and to sustaining, or absorbing rather, our wastes. There are a number of lessons from this. No city can be sustainable on its own. The concept of a sustainable city is meaningless outside of global context. It doesn't matter what Vancouver does. If the rest of the world maintains its current track, we go down with the rest of the world. In other words, there can be no urban sustainability without rural sustainability or global security. Now, here's a kicker. Dependable access to these distant hinterlands, which we are exploiting, depends on climate stability, geopolitical harmony, and abundant cheap energy. None of these conditions is likely to continue much more into the future. The climate situation is becoming increasingly dire. Extremely hot weather events have now increased by a factor of 50 compared to the period before 1950. The first 13 years of this century include 12 of the warmest 14 years on record. The world is on track, nobody disputes this any longer, to achieve about a 4-degree, even 6-degree Celsius warming. This would imply by the end of this century that most of China, most of India, much of northern South America, Mexico, the United States, I could go on, will be virtually uninhabitable by the end of this century. So when I asked a question this morning, are we prepared to confront literally tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of climate change or ecological refugees, because there's much more than that involved, that was not an idle question. This is the direction in which we are going. Report after report after report that never reaches our popular press talks about mass migrations, food and other resource shortages, and subsequent geopolitical chaos. Even the World Bank, just over a year ago now, reported, based on work they commissioned from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change in Germany, one of the top in the world, that the projected 4-degree warming simply must not be allowed to occur. In OECD countries, and Canada primary among them, we should be striving now to develop policies to induce an 80% reduction in fossil fuel use by mid-century, and we should be out of fossil fuels absolutely before the end of this century. This would require a 6% per year cut in our use of fossil fuels or reduction in emissions, just to get us to that 80% reduction by about 2040 and free us from fossil fuels by 2090. The other point that has come out of recent studies is that 2/3 to 3/4 of recoverable fossil fuel reserves must be left in the ground if we're to avoid 2 degrees of warming, which I've just unplugged myself. Can somebody do that? Unfortunately, the cord is on the floor here. Yeah, well, fine, thank you. A recent study, just 2 weeks ago actually, has suggested that the sort of unofficial target of limiting global warming to 2 degrees is vastly too much. We really should be looking at 1 degree. Keep in mind that the climate damages currently being incurred around the world are the result of less than 0.8 degree of warming, and that it is a response to conditions that existed between 20 and 60 years ago. There's a 20 to 60-year lag between cause and effect in the climate domain. So what we're seeing today is a result of emissions that far back, and to go even the additional 0.2 degrees to 1 degree warming may take us to the brink of intolerable climate change in particular locales at any rate. The target now, and we will see emerge over the next 5 or 6 years, will be 1 degree of warming and a return to 350 parts per million, or billion rather, of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's currently at 400 parts per million. Despite all of these dire warnings, and here we have this enormous conflict now between science and global capital, the world remains addicted to fossil fuels. And almost every serious energy analyst suggests we're going to remain so for the foreseeable future. Thank you. So this is just a profile of showing up to 2030, the point at which we should be essentially down to about 60% of our current fossil fuel use, steadily upward. So if the climate change literature is true, this is a disaster scenario, and yet it's what every single major energy and analytical institute is telling us. The World Energy Organization, the United States Energy Information, this is a BP analysis. And notice that renewables, you hear so much now about the emergence of solar and wind and so on, they're taking over the planet. It's 2.5% of global energy supply today, headed for maybe 5% in the next 15 years. So we've got a huge gap here to follow. Keep in mind, people are not aware that getting ahead of myself. Peak oil has already occurred in the conventional sector. In 2006, the world reached its maximum output of conventional oil, and it's been downhill at about 4 to 6% every year since. The gap is being filled by things like oil sands, tar sands, and other forms of non-conventional oil, but they can barely keep up. And the fact that our gas prices continue to rise during this big boom of so-called fracked oil and gas in North America is indicative of the high cost of exploration. Energy is not going to be able to be taken for granted in the future. I'm not giving you models, I'm giving you real data. Here are the data from 3 of the largest oil companies on the planet. The blue lines indicate production, the yellow lines represent the amount of investment in exploration. You can see there's no correlation. We're investing more and more, getting less and less. Big time diminishing returns, so that the amount of capital going into exploring for oil and gas now is in decline. We're not finding, and there's no point in exploring if there's nothing there to find. New discoveries have not matched consumption since '86. Conventional production is falling at a greater than 4% per year. Non-conventional production is barely filling the gap. 37 countries are past peak, and we need a new Saudi Arabia every 3 or 4 years just to maintain the status quo. In renewable energy, again, any practical substitute for petroleum must be cheap, abundant, and increasingly available, transformable into liquid fuel similar to oil, and non-polluting. There are none. And in total, the renewable energy system today barely generates sufficient energy to produce the machines that they use to produce that energy. So we have an energy problem, big time. The cities of the world today are utterly energy dependent to make those connections to the rest of the world. Vancouver has become, obviously, a major export and import port on the west coast of North America. By the way, we're also rapidly becoming one of the world's major exporters of climate change. I'm not sure that's a badge of honor, but let's keep in mind that that's precisely what's happening. This city is losing control. This region is losing control to big capital and to senior levels of government over its future development and role in this world. And I think this is something that regional and local politicians have got to resist, full stop. It's not just in oil and gas. This is a plot of investment in all of the essential minerals to maintain a modern civilization. Again, diminishing returns. There has not been a major discovery in well over a decade, despite rising billions of dollars in investment. Bottom line, in coming years, now listen, this sounds right off the wall, but it is not. There are serious debates. I'm speaking tonight at yet another of them on the concept of degrowth. How do we manage a sustainable way down, so to speak, in the face of these trends? In coming years, the human enterprise will likely contract. As an intelligent, forward-looking, plan-capable, moral species, we can theoretically choose between maintaining business as usual, which our governments in Ottawa and BC seem absolutely committed to, which, if climate science is even basically correct, risks a chaotic implosion imposed by nature, followed by economic upheaval, followed by geopolitical turmoil and resource wars. Now that's the future as it unfolds on the current track, and even the World Bank is absolutely on side with that diagnosis. Or, as planners, we can urge a well-planned, orderly, and cooperative descent toward a socially just sustainability for all. That's the real dilemma. Now obviously there's lots of stuff in between, but these are the bookends of the human future. And again, a huge opportunity for Vancouver, should we choose to seize it, to lead the way. One of the, it seems to me, outcomes of all this is to begin to reconceive urban sustainability. We must reconceive the city not only as the built-up area or its political entity, but the hinterland that is utterly a part of the human ecosystem needed to sustain the city. You cannot have the consuming core without the productive periphery. So we need to reconceive the city system as a complete human ecosystem, and this is the ultimate in biomimicry. Maximize regional self-reliance. Here we are paving over our farmland in this hope that food can always be imported from California and Mexico, which are drying up even as we speak. Minimize dependence on trade and exogenous energy supplies. Reconfigure the city from resource depleting as a throughput system to a self-sustaining circular flow system. But of course, I'm talking about this much larger regional city surrounded by its own productive hinterlands. Facilitate the reduction of residents' ecological footprints to the globally equitable 1.7 average hectares per capita. Currently, it's 5 to 6 or maybe even 7 here in Vancouver. That's our fair share of the earth. There's 1.7 average productive hectares per capita on this planet. It keeps us somewhere between 5 and 7 to maintain the Vancouver vision. We've got a hell of a challenge. I'm excited as the dickens about leading the world down this new path, so let's get on board. Thank you.